Welcome to Bottom Line with Bob and Kendel Ehrlich. This episode 15, we are fighting back. You're going to hear a lot about that, and we'd love to hear from you at ehrlichbottomline@gmail.com. Please email us questions, thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. We also ask you to follow us on Twitter at Earl, EHRL, Bottom Line, and at Bob_Ehrlich, and at Kendel Ehrlich. So, what do you think? Are we fighting back?
We are fighting back. That's the theme of this week's show, because I know you want to be heard, and I want to recognize you. In
Thank you.
1 second.
Shall I raise my hand?
No. But we've had shows in the past on what's wrong, and then you demanded a show on what we do about it. And today is chapter 3 in that series, which is fighting back. What's happening? Yeah. But we have a few preliminary words, I know, that you want to talk about.
Well, this weekend,
yes.
We had a great tribute to your dad.
Yeah.
And it was incredibly heartwarming, incredible to see probably 300 plus people at Town Hall in Arbutus, where it needed to be.
Where else?
It was actually the perfect day, getting your sandwich,
your pit beef
sandwich, and enjoying some great company, and really 300 plus of our closest friends, many people we hadn't seen in a very long time.
Yep.
It was just wonderful to be there, to hear stories about Dad, to hear stories about the past. And it was just an incredible tribute to an incredible man. And I just thought it was great. The other thing that was so great that is appropriate for our show here today, and that is, excuse me, how people were touching each other and shaking each other's hands.
You're all choked up about it.
Excuse me, I am. It was just so great. It was like everybody was set free all at once. And it was so great that it could happen on that day, on a tribute for him. Because talk about the guy that touched everybody and said, Vote for my son, vote for my boy. Is my boy going to win?
For the non-Marylanders watching our show, my father was one of the all-time characters. Probably the most effective poll worker we've ever seen. So obnoxious at the polls that he got away with it because he was my dad.
Yeah, how can you say no when you say vote for my boy, vote
for my boy, son. Vote for my baby boy, vote for my... I remember Congress at the time, by the way, or the legislature, and people loved it, and the older ladies particularly loved it because they come out after voting, and they come up to my dad and say, "Oh, I voted for your boy," and he'd say, "Oh, thank you." And by the way, when this goes over hour after hour after hour, the opposition at the polls is watching this.
They went home.
Who's voting for our guy? Who's voting for our candidate? But that was my dad, unqualified love, and a great dad. But at its very foundation,
love.
Unconditioned, unqualified, unconditional, and he welcomed you into the circle of trust.
That's right.
About 29 years ago.
Oh, I was very lucky.
So we're going to get back to the Mass, because that fits with the theme of the show. But we do want to talk this week about what's happening on the ground, because sometimes some of the feedback we get from folks on our show is, well, geez, we like the show, but geez, it's so negative. It's the Biden administration. It's tough. It's really tough to listen to. But because it's now 5 months and things have gone south in so many ways, there are things happening on the ground that may, by the way, large and small, that we need to talk about. We need to offer hope, and not just hope, real substance to folks who've already had it. 5 months in, they've already had it. So I've come up with a list of 7-8 items, my dear. And the first is something we've talked a little bit about in the past, parents fighting back. This is the issue of the next 6 months, the next year, the next 5 years. Because unbeknownst to a lot of parents, unbeknownst to the average parent, I would argue, the progressive curricula, that movement, progressive school boards, the indoctrination, if you will, has been ongoing for years, and it's happened it's happening so quietly, I should say, that most parents, most PTAs, most voters did not know about it. With the advent of the Floyd murder, with COVID-19, with January 6th, it's now come full circle and full light, and people are reacting. So even, by the way, in not necessarily red subdivisions, in one red subdivision, South Lake Dallas, parents saw what was happening. They saw the movement. They saw literally the new program that their children would be indoctrinated under. They got together. They formed a PAC. They interviewed candidates. They raised the money. They had the fundraisers. They had an election, and they knocked them all out. And the vote was not close, by the way.
Right. That's protest, right?
We love it. It's speech. It's speech, right?
It is speech. It's what the country's built on. And one positive thing out of the pandemic is that paying attention to all of this now, paying attention down ballot, paying attention to who's running for school board, paying attention to what your kid's being taught. I'll bet your parents are much more involved, but those PTA meetings are going to be packed across the country. And as a result of this pandemic, that we had very little control, we being parents, public, had very little control, didn't have a lot of information. And the information we were getting was changing all the time. The goalpost kept moving.
Yep.
And we didn't like it. And guess who else didn't? The kids, who got that the goalpost kept moving.
And you don't get much more down ballot than school board elections. So very few people have paid attention to these elections. But then now we see the stakes, and the stakes have never been higher. Never been higher. Because we're talking about indoctrination rather than education.
So kudos to those groups fighting back.
And by the way, Loudoun County, Virginia, not necessarily a red area. Same thing, a major pushback. You saw the reports on Fox the other night, all the major media outlets, parents fighting back, showing up, screaming bloody murder, literally outing these new ideas. It's really what amounts to indoctrination, not education for our kids. It's happening more across the country. It's good news. We promised you we'd bring you some good news, and that's certainly item one with respect to how we fight back. Because you're asked all the time as we're out. Last night I was at a Republican event. What do we do? There's no election for the next year and a half. What do we do? Well, guess what? There's one thing. You organize and you fight back where and when you can. You raise the money, you identify the candidates, and you win. And by the way, babe, those elections, the school board elections, were not close.
That's great news.
Yeah, it really is great news.
And you can take that to your community, and you can do the same thing.
Yeah, this is not about. We all agree on equality, obviously, and inclusion and diversity. These are great goals, but not the way these folks are identifying them. That's for sure. We have moved so far away from Dr. King. We've moved so far away from what, well, this is another show, but what the civil rights movement was and should be. And it's just been taken over by these progressives, and it has to stop. So that's number one. Number two, Pennsylvania voters voted to strip Governor Wolf, one of the most liberal progressive governors in the country, of his emergency powers that he exercised during the pandemic. The voters shot back. The voters stood up and said, no, we're not doing it. And great it was a rejection of unchecked authority under cover of COVID.
It's also happening in my Philly DA show too.
You know what? We're going to devote a show to Law and Order. And you're going to run that show.
We need to.
Because you've been watching that show a lot. Yes, we do. By the way, the bill also gave the power to the Assembly to check future overreaching by Democratic governors. I'll say Democratic governors.
Well, it's probably all governors, right? Either side.
Yeah,
on either side.
But I hope a Republican governor wouldn't exercise this kind
exactly.
of extraordinary power by requiring an affirmative vote of 2/3 of the legislature. So in the future, they're saying, no. If 2/3 legislature agree, extraordinary powers. Minus that, sorry.
That's great. And
regular order.
That is another thing that your state can work on, and that your delegate, your assemblyman, whoever it may be, you should get on the phone. You should look that up, and you can encourage that as well as protest, or at least go down to your legislature and get that going.
And for folks who are listening, watching us, or coming to know our show in Pennsylvania, we need a Republican governor. We need a Republican attorney general in that state.
Boy, do we ever.
For lots of reasons.
Yeah.
Including
fair elections.
2024. So, again, good news. Texas. Do you love Texas?
No, I love Texas.
That was a rhetorical question.
How'd you know?
So listen to this now, because this has not gotten a lot of press, but it's really interesting.
It's so Texas, though.
It's so Texas, but it's so smart.
It is
The
smart.
Texas House passed a bill to trigger de-annexation in parts of any city or in parts of any, so that any part of a city could literally de-annex itself from the city that voted to defund the police. How do you like that one? Think about that. You could de-annex your neighborhood, your smaller subdivision, from the larger subdivision if the larger subdivision voted to defund the police. How about that?
I think that's great, and it's a check on safety. It's clear that people feel unsafe, and they don't want to feel that way. A couple things that people rely on government to do. Locally, you need your trash picked up, and you want to feel safe.
Yep.
Get into your car with your kids in your neighborhood, going to your local store. Safety is the key. On a federal level, we used to hope that the mail would get delivered on time. That's iffy right now. But safety is still an issue.
Sound like your parents.
That's what it is. Safety is an
Well,
issue.
as former chief executive of a
What's wrong
major
with that?
state, job one is public safety.
Right.
Always. As chief executive,
Always.
that's what we worry about.
Safety.
Terrorism,
Yeah,
safety, crime,
exactly.
right?
You were right after 9/11.
So, by the way, this is targeted to Austin, and the fascinating thing about the vote as the debate unfolded was that I believe 11 Democrats voted for the bill. Most of those Democrats, South Texas Democrats, most of those Democrats have seen a giant wave of pro-Trump voters from Democrat voters in the last election. And the reason was immigration, unchecked illegal immigration, and Austin. This is directed to Austin, what's happened to Austin. So it applies to cities of 250,000 or more folks. And by that definition, under the bill, 11 cities will be in play.
Now, I don't know if a lot of other states can do a de-annexation bill. Texas has always threatened de-annexation for various things. So maybe that's not an example that you can take to your legislature, but you never know.
Well, there are splits in the Republican Party we've talked about. There's also splits in the Democratic Party. We're seeing a huge one with Israel right now, and the Palestinians in Israel. But we're also seeing a split in the Democratic Party between Democrats, particularly border Democrats,
Exactly.
who are answering phones, getting the emails, getting the texts from their constituents. Enough. Enough. Enough.
And let me tell you, then the other aspect is people leaving. You know, when you have a state like Maryland bordered by 4 different states, it's not so difficult to leave and go to the state that has your philosophy and that your level of taxation that you want in your life, et cetera, et cetera.
So this is a split among Democrats, progressive Democrats, more traditional, maybe moderate liberal Democrats, in South Texas, where Donald Trump flipped those votes big time, as he did in Florida. Hispanic votes I'm talking about. These Democrats are paying attention, so 11 Democrats voted for the bill. And again, a real philosophical split in the Democratic Party. Oregon. Oregon is fighting back. So conservatives in Oregon have come up with, and by the way, this is not the first time this vote occurred, because it happened last year. I believe it was last year. This is 5 Oregon subdivisions this time. 2 Oregon subdivisions last time have voted to leave Oregon.
Why not?
And be annexed into Idaho. I love this. Now, it's probably not going to happen because obviously the state would have to approve, Congress would have to approve. But
I was just going to say the federal government has to approve that.
But what's really interesting in reading about this, the politics of this piece of legislation, just like Maryland, people see Maryland, they see blue, they see Oregon, they see blue. But the fact of it is, when you count up the subdivisions, most are red. Most are red. The big cities are blue, overwhelmingly blue. The inner suburbs, most of the time, are very blue. But when you start counting subdivisions in a state, like in Maryland, we have probably now 6 blue subdivisions. But that's it. But again, if you look at the map, you see the red. It's not accurate. It will disarm you because you think, oh, we could win here. But when you look at the cities, obviously the turnout, the population, the density, it's a problem.
It should, however, be a signal to those that are elected in Oregon to say, hey, there's a lot of people. I guess it depends on the gerrymandering and
they know, but these folks are disenfranchised. 23,
and they're tired of being disenfranchised. Just like, you look at the Eastern Shore of Maryland, various other areas of Maryland, like you just said.
26 of 36 subdivisions in this state, in Oregon, are red. But again, relatively few people live there. They don't have the power in the legislature, and it's not going to change. It's not going to change. And those cities and those Democrats and those progressives don't have to pay attention to this. It may be temporarily embarrassing.
They're migrating to Montana.
Well, or Idaho or somewhere. Texas, Florida. We'll get to Florida.
My
One of your
state.
favorite states. All right. This is interesting because a couple years ago, we read an article and we talked about it. And I believe I wrote it. I did write a piece about it for Western Journal, where Jerry Seinfeld and Chris Rock had talked about the fact they would not do college campuses anymore. They just wouldn't do it.
Such a shame.
Because of political correctness. Because of, this was even before cancel culture, but it was cancel culture. So Chris Rock went off again last week. He was no right-winger. Chris Rock is no right-winger. But he's a comedian. And comedians live on the line, to cross the line. Right? That's what makes you laugh.
Exactly.
So if you're a comedian and you are stuck in cancel culture world, you're not going to be funny. And that's his point. Now,
their material's often on a stereotype.
Yes.
Making fun of an ethnic group.
Yes.
And people identify with it.
And they
mostly
laugh.
the same ethnic group, by the way, usually identifies with the comedy and laughs.
So some quotes from Chris Rock, who we like and we think is very funny. Comedians are scared. They see a lot. So he sees a lot of unfunny TV shows, a lot of unfunny award shows, a lot of unfunny movies. That's not a good place to be for a comedian. Comedians get canceled when people don't laugh. I love this last line because, listen, we don't need cancel culture. If you have an audience and you're a comedian and people are coming to laugh and they don't laugh, they're canceling you by not laughing, right? That's the audition and that's the review. You did not have a good night. Who needs cancel culture if you're a comedian and you're not funny? So again, Chris Rock, Jerry Seinfeld, I don't believe he's a Republican either. But if you're a comedian and you want to be particularly edgy, and some of the funniest comedians are edgy and always have been edgy, by the way. This is not Bob Hope we're talking about. We're talking about
Don Rickles.
Well, we grew up with Don Rickles and love him, but
he couldn't survive.
He couldn't survive today. He could not survive today. And he was one of the most popular comics in the country. And a regular Johnny Carson, we sound like our parents again, but that's just the way it is. So the big news of this week has been Dr. Fauci coming out with, you know what? On second thought, it may have escaped from the lab, but we're not sure. Now,
does this guy drive you crazy or what?
Well, but not just Dr. Fauci, because congressional Republicans are now demanding information on the origins of COVID-19. I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
What recently departed former president talked about this maybe a year ago? And who was torched for it?
Right.
Absolutely torched for it. Right?
Well, there was so much he was torched for that he shouldn't have been.
Well, the fact of it is, President Trump talked about this. He was absolutely torched by the mainstream media, as were Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity and any other conservative pundit who dared, I guess, challenge the line from the Chinese government.
The bat theory?
Yeah, the bat theory, the local wet market and all that. So Republicans in Congress have demanded classified briefings from the Department of Homeland Security, under whose auspices this falls. We talked about President Trump. So why is this important? Obviously it's important, but last time I checked, 3.4 million worldwide deaths. I believe 600,000 in the United States of America, 600,000 Americans, 3.4 million worldwide. And the media was so quick to dismiss the lab theory. Why? Well, let's not upset the Chinese communist regime in Beijing.
Well, as you told me, that's what the whole election was about.
Yeah, well, certainly from
China.
Well, part
in
of the
many
election,
respects.
in many respects, particularly business respects. So the tide's now turning. All of a sudden now, Dr. Fauci is saying, we need to take another look at this because that could be a viable theory.
Well, he may be also guided by his attorneys since there's some accusations around him and the finances that came out of the CDC, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Now, by the way, this is not necessarily a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy of silence after the fact, but it could have just been an accident. But of course, the Chinese have When the WTO investigators showed up, they were not cooperative. And that's a matter of record. Even the WTO raised concerns. So we're not saying it was on purpose. It was purposeful. They're trying to kill people. It could have been just a lab accident, but the fact of it is, it could have been the lab. And that's precisely what the president said, and a lot of folks on the right said. And it seemed, we're not scientists, we're lawyers, but pretty common sense that was a viable theory, given the really smart people that we were watching on TV and listening to, saying, yeah, it's what we don't know. We need a real investigation. Are the Chinese going to really cooperate with that investigation? No.
And even 60 Minutes several weeks ago did a piece on the same thing and saying that
Yeah.
we don't have enough information.
Yeah.
To make any conclusions regarding this, and for them to come out and say that, it was pretty shocking as well.
Yeah, I was one to give Fauci a pass, as you know, for a long time, because particularly early on, everybody gets a pass early on, right, left, doesn't matter. Nancy Pelosi, President Trump, whomever. But again, he's been so all over the map. And now he's admitted, with regard to his early statements, they weren't a function of the science. They were a function of, do we have enough masks? And so he's really admitted to his, what's the word I'm looking for? Uneven approach to these issues. I'll be kind.
Political. He was political.
Very political.
He was very political. And as a result, we've talked about this before, those of us who grew up believing that science was factual and that you need to trust the science, now we're very skeptical.
Yeah.
And, people make fun of those that have conspiracy theories and this, that, and the other, but that's because the science wasn't there and it wasn't backed up and it wasn't utilized. And we didn't have a team. This country has so many great scientists. You can't tell me that we couldn't have assembled a great team that could have gathered around and done more than this. And I recognize that the administration didn't know at the time who to trust or where to go. But when Fauci started again moving that goalpost,
Yep.
Something else should have happened. And or some of those press conferences should have ceased right then and there.
Science is objective.
Supposed to be objective, factual, based on experimentation.
Tax cuts good, tax cuts bad, subjective.
Right.
How you feel about the Palestinians and Israel and the peace process and two-state solution, three-state solution, subjective. But you don't get to make up your history. You don't get to make up your facts.
Right.
And science is supposed to be an objective process, and we've just lost that. Why?
Dr. Fauci.
Well, ultimately, why? Why? To beat Donald Trump. That's what all this has been about. Now, again, from Texas. A little piece, not earth-shattering issue. Now, we're getting to your guy next, okay? We have two more left. Bill in the legislature is going to be signed by the governor. We've seen protests. There's nothing more American than protests. You've heard my speech about protests, and you've heard my speech about free speech and Dr. King and the movements of the 60s and what he taught, the civil rights movement and the women's movement, the anti-war movement. This country was founded on speech, free speech, the First Amendment. I have a whole speech devoted to it. We all know it. But part of that speech does not give you the ability to walk in front of a fire truck, ambulance, you name it, and stop that vehicle on the way to the hospital.
Right.
And that's what Texas has done. They further sanctioned that quote-unquote peaceful. It's not peaceful if you're costing a life. If that's your wife, your son, your neighbor in that vehicle, you want that vehicle getting to the hospital now.
It's the old fire in the movie theater. You can't do that. You have free speech, but that's not free speech.
It's not free speech.
Because that endangers others.
Right. So blocking traffic, especially emergency vehicles, is not speech. Texas has, again, affirmed that common sense rule. They're being criticized for it, but I don't think Texas cares. So good for Texas again, and good for the legislature, and good for the governor, and good for the lieutenant governor. It's why so many people are moving to Texas. Now, I get to your guy. Your guy. DeSantis.
Governor DeSantis.
DeSantis strikes again.
He's forward thinking.
Well, this is interesting. We're not going to get into this in great detail. I just saw this article this morning, but we did want to raise it because Florida is now cracking down on subjective supervision of speech, and they're attaching potential penalties to it. By what I mean is governor signed a bill, which he's touting as first of its kind in the nation. And it requires big tech to treat Floridians fairly, which means, again, no changing the goalposts, right? The rules are the rules, and it safeguards the rights of Floridians, obviously, on social media. What's interesting is it allows the Attorney General of Florida to bring an action against technology companies that violate the law under Florida's Unfair Deceptive Trade Practices Act. It also prohibits, which seems to be common sense, you would hope, the deplatforming of political candidates. You talk about speech.
Oh my gosh.
You talk about
that
fundamental rights of free speech in a democracy.
Exactly.
You cannot deplatform political candidates.
That's the core of our democracy. So, kudos.
Read 1984 and figure it out. Read Orwell. So big tech is prohibited from deplatforming Floridian political candidates. The Election Commission will impose fines of $250,000 a day. This shouldn't be a state issue. It needs to be a federal issue. And it needs to be, hopefully, the platforms, big tech, which is the new euphemism, you would hope would come to Congress with all this controversy, deplatforming this, not deplatforming that. You see it playing out now in the Israel-Palestinian conflict. It's not consistent. And the people, the taxpayers, the voters, Americans have a right to expect consistency from those who have this gigantic foundation called platforms on social media, because they're very popular. They're not going away. People are going to use social media. They love social media for the most part. It has a really wonderful role to play. We talked about when my dad passed, and the ability of social media to reach people. There's a very big upside to it, very positive side to it, but there's a downside to it. And we've seen that play out during a very intense election campaign this past year. Everybody needs to get their act together, both sides. Because if you're going to have this platform, you cannot move the goalposts. You just cannot do it, or you're going to lose credibility and you're going to hurt yourself in the long run.
I think that big tech is doubling down, though, in many respects. They're not really doing too much about it. So I think it's going to take individual states and maybe the federal government at some point in time, when they can find the right majority to do it, to address the issue.
You would hope. And look, we're probably the last show you're going to listen to that would, in the first instance, look to the federal government to cure a problem. Right? We believe in the 10th Amendment, right? We believe in federalism. But when you're talking about these platforms and about their reach, you're talking about a federal resolution. Has to be, should be. We hope people of good faith will come together and get it done.
Well, it's because of the monopoly aspect of some of these companies, too, and their immense control. And so I think that's why we lean toward the federal government having an issue here. In the meantime, states can do things like this in order to push the discussion and push the envelope.
Yeah. I'm not opining. We're not opining on the constitutionality of this approach. We're just saying, look, this is a show about fighting back, about reaction to what's happening in our country. And we're going to close here in a minute, but the bottom line, the show's called The Bottom Line. The bottom line to what we talked about in the first instance here was no more masks, no longer wearing masks, no longer having to put your mask on to go to the local Wawa, or to go to an event honoring your dad, or to go to a political fundraiser, or to live life. Americans have a responsibility and a right. They really have a responsibility to live their lives. Right? That's what makes our culture. It makes society go. And as you said, babe, how great it was to hug people, to touch them, to greet them.
It was almost like people were hesitant a little bit.
Not us. Yeah. We're huggers.
No.
We are huggers. Admittedly, we're huggers. It was a very bad year for huggers last year. But people need to shake hands. If you're a hugger, fine. If you're not a hugger, that's great. It's a free country. People need to return to normalcy. And again, I think the bottom line to all of this is, from the right, we understand a lot of this stuff was about defeating Donald Trump. We resent it. We lost. We get it. but we want our normal back. There's no such thing as a new normal. We want our normal back. You're not going to change those societal goalposts, those cultural goalposts on us anymore. And you see this starting, and we've talked a little bit about it today.
So listen to us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thanks for listening.
Godspeed.